Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Hannah Gould, and I am the Digital Marketing Officer for the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to part 2 of ICMEC's Children on the Move webinar series, Protecting Children on the Move from Going Missing. Today, you will hear a presentation from ICMEC's Director of Global Missing Children's Issues, Dr. Felicity Sackville Northcott. Dr. Northcutt is a subject matter expert on international child welfare and missing children's issues. Dr. Northcutt has trained hundreds of professionals on their roles in cross-border child protection cases, best practices in international family finding and engagement, and managing complex international child welfare cases. Recently, she is leading ongoing groundbreaking research in collaboration with the Program Evaluation and Research Lab at Boise State University, which will result in the first evidence-based number of missing children globally. So you are aware this webinar will be recorded, and there will be a short Q&A session following Dr. Northcott's presentation. So please feel free to write any questions in the Q&A section, and we will get to as many of them as possible. Now I will go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Northcott.
Thank you, Hannah. First, I want to welcome everybody to this important webinar. And we're going to be discussing how to best protect children who are on the move from going missing. Please feel free to ask any questions, as Hannah said, and I will do my best to answer those at the end of the presentation. And for our participants, if there are any participants for whom English is not your first language, and I'm speaking too quickly or I'm using vernacular or terms of which you are not aware, please just let Hannah know and she'll give me a little poke and tell me to slow down so that everybody can keep up with what we're talking about. Uh-oh, why is this not moving forward? Oh, there we go. So the first question is, who are children on the move and how do they go missing? Before I talk about that, I want to address, as we say, the elephant in the room, which is that in the discussion of protecting children on the move from going missing, this could sort of be seen almost as sort of counterintuitive or circular logic, because many of the children who are on the move may actually be seen as already missing. They may be gone from their families may not know where they are. And while we're going to acknowledge that that is certainly the case, it is my hope that we can use the information that I'm going to be sharing with you today to better address the growing problem of children moving within and across national borders and the vulnerabilities to all kinds of potential harm, but also going missing from their families. So with that acknowledgement, I will begin. So the groups of children that we're going to be talking about that are on the move are refugees, asylum seekers, seasonal migrants, and unaccompanied children. Children are seen as being on the move because they are forced to, or they move by choice. Forced movement includes fleeing war or armed conflict, fleeing environmental disasters. We saw this particularly in situations, the Haitian earthquake, for example, the tsunami, so drought. Forcing children to move because of environmental disasters is a very common reason that children are migrating. Ethnic, religious, racial, tribal, or other persecution, forcing children to flee for their safety because of who they are or how they are identified. Family disruption. We see this a lot in the United States, where a parent has moved to another country prior to the children joining them. And so the children leave their home country in order to join the parent or parents in the foreign country. Children on the move can also be children who are facing abuse or neglect at home, or children who are in alternative care situations. Children also are forced to move because of the lack of work in their home country or their home city, state, town, and so are required to go to more urban areas where there are opportunities for employment. So those are the sort of the forced movements. Voluntary movement, we often hear this term used, and I would caution everyone from assuming that children have real agency when it comes to making decisions about leaving their home, their country, or their family. It's important to note that children may be classified as voluntary migrants when in fact they have been forced to by family or others to find work or to reunite. It's important to note that even if the child is old enough to make the decision to leave their home, they are at no less risk for going missing or being exploited than children who are forcibly moving. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, particularly as it relates to another category of missing children, which are runaways. Going missing is only one potential danger faced by children on the move. The exploitation of children on the move, especially those that are not in the care of an appropriate adult or guardian, are many. And it is important to note that, as always, ICMEC believes that there is a direct link between children going missing and children being exploited. Some of the additional vulnerabilities to going missing for children on the move include sex and labor trafficking. We're seeing this a lot in the Ukraine situation. Sexual exploitation by the adults who are traveling with the children, coming to physical harm, and it could be physical harm at the hands of another person. It could be physical harm because the trip itself requires the child to cross terrain or enter into situations that cause them to come to harm. Traumatic psychological events. For those of you who saw the first of these webinars, you know that Dr. Jordan talked a lot about what the psychological and emotional impact, not only on the journey itself, but on the separation from family, and again, the exposure to these other harmful events. Forced gang or armed conflict. It is not unusual for children who are either en route to a new country or a new location to be taken by people and forced into gang activity or other criminal activity, or even forcing them into armed conflict, forcing them to become child soldiers and forcing them to engage in armed conflict. And then finally, of course, going missing. So how do children on the move go missing? Like any child who is alone and away from home, children on the move are vulnerable to those who will do them harm. Like runaways, children on the move are highly vulnerable to trafficking, abduction, or simply disappearing and never heard from again. Traffickers are fully aware that children on the move are vulnerable to their enticements to recruit them into either forced sexual exploitation, forced work, slavery, all those sorts of things. Anywhere that a trafficker can identify a vulnerable child and promise them work or food or housing or whatever the child is in need of, they will use those locations to abduct those, to traffic those children and exploit that vulnerability of being alone and not with an appropriate adult guardian. Children are also abducted on their journeys, and again, can be forced into gangs, drug trafficking, harmed, or even killed. Abduction is very common. There is no one who can immediately identify that that child has been abducted and is missing. This is particularly true of unaccompanied minors. If they disappear en route, the family from where they left or to the family to where they're going may not know for days or weeks or months that that child has been abducted. Finally, thousands of children on the move simply disappear. During the height of COVID, there was a lot of information about kids who were either unaccompanied minors or were seeking asylum or were refugees, particularly in the EU, that simply became unaccounted for. All the locations where they would normally gather to get food or clothing or medical care were closed during the pandemic. So these children just disappeared. And in one anecdote, one of the Global Missing Children Network partners said that in their country alone, there were 25,000 unaccompanied migrant children that they simply couldn't account for anymore. So we know who they are and how they go missing and what their vulnerabilities are. So I want to talk a little bit about what our responsibilities to these children are. And I think the most important way to understand that is to talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because there are several key portions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child that relate directly to our responsibility to children who are outside the care of their families. I particularly want to talk about the highly vulnerable children on the move, because we have seen that in far too many countries, the governments of these countries are not properly caring for their children who enter into their countries or are leaving their countries. As we know, every country in the world, with one notable exception, has signed the convention. And I am a firm believer that there is far more that we can do to ensure that the rights outlined in the convention are equally applied to every child, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of their racial, ethnic, or religious identification. And so I want to talk for a few minutes just about a couple of what I think are the key components of the convention that relate directly to protecting children on the move and protecting them from going missing. So the first one seems sort of obvious, that a child should be, defined as someone under 18 years old. But as Hannah noted, I've been working with a group of statisticians out of Boise State University. And one of the things that we looked at in terms of how are we going to define what is a missing child and how do missing children get reported is looking at which countries do not adhere to the idea that a child is 18 or younger. In some countries, the age of childhood stops at 14. And so the first thing we need to do to protect children on the move, because a majority of them tend to be older than sort of the 12, 13, 14-year-olds, we need to make sure that every country adheres to the definition of a child being 18 or less. Because when we don't, those older children, the sort of young adult youth, will not be afforded the same protections and rights as children who are defined as children under the age of 14 or so. We need to set the age limit at 18 and maintain that globally, universally. Sorry, I skipped over this. So there are two parts of Article 2 of the convention that are really exceptionally important when it comes to protecting children on the move from going missing and protecting them from coming to harm or exploitation. And the first one states that parties shall respect and ensure the rights set forth in the present convention to each child in their jurisdiction without discrimination of any kind. This is crucial because we have seen over the years, and particularly notably in the United States under the previous administration, that children coming into our country were not treated with the same protections and rights as children who are legally present in the United States. The second part of Article 2 that is important is that state parties shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that the child is protected from all forms of discrimination or punishment based on, the status, activities, expressed opinions, or belief of the child's parents, legal guardians, or family members. Again, this is really important because what we're seeing is that when children are on the move and they're not afforded these protections because of their beliefs of their parents or the adherence of their parents to ideas that may be in contradiction or conflict with the ruling folks in the country in which they are located, that these children have become particularly vulnerable to becoming separated from their parents. The parents are taken into custody, or the parents are deported, and the child is left without appropriate adult guardianship. It's also important to note that because the vast majority of children on the move are fleeing some kind of persecution or an intolerable situation, this anti-discrimination language is crucial to ensuring that they do not face further discrimination or exploitation either during their journey or when they arrive at the country or location of final destination. Regardless of the child's immigration status in their country of final destination, they must be afforded the same protections and rights as any other child. Finally, Article 20, and I will be talking more about this when we talk about appropriate responses to protecting and supporting children on the move. Article 20 has 3 important rights that unfortunately are mostly absent in far too many countries, particularly when the country the child is going to is not the country of origin, of their origin. The first is any child temporarily or permanently deprived of his or her family environment, or in whose own best interest cannot be allowed to remain in that environment, shall be entitled to special protection and assistance provided by that state. So we need to look at these children as being in need of additional supports that are not being necessarily afforded to children who are legally present in the country, but fall under the same rubric of child protection and not immigration enforcement or law enforcement. Second, state parties shall, in accordance with their national laws, ensure alternative care for such a child. Again, we saw this quite frequently in the United States, that there were not appropriate guidelines for implementing alternative care for children. There were insufficient resources to provide alternative care for children. And so children were ending up in situations that was unhealthy and dangerous for them because they were being housed in situations that were not safe. When we talk about alternative care, the Convention on the Rights of the Child includes, but is not limited to, foster placement, kafala of Islamic law, adoption, or if necessary, placement in suitable institutions for the care of children. Institutional care for children is always a last choice, but when you see large numbers of children moving, there is often no alternative other than large institutional care sites. But there needs to be very clear guidelines on how those institutions are run, what is the ratio of children to caregivers, and those kinds of issues. We have seen over the past several years countries refusing to provide alternative care for children on the move. We've seen horrific pictures of children housed in cages, warehoused in locations that are unsanitary, unsafe, and have placed these children in highly dangerous situations related to both their psychological and physical well-being. There are rampant anecdotal information about people who are responsible for the care of children in institutions, sexually exploiting them. Traffickers, as I stated earlier, are fully aware that going into institutions where children are housed when they've been on the move are ideal places to entice them to leave with them with promises of work or food or whatever the situation is. So we need to do far better when it comes to providing and looking at alternative care measures for children on the move. I'm going to ask Hannah to drop into the chat the links for both the UN guidelines on alternative care and the corresponding implementing the guidelines for the alternative care of children. If you haven't read them, I highly recommend them. It really is important, as we see an increased movement of children, that every country is prepared to provide safe alternative care. And these guidelines are obviously the best practice when it comes to doing that. So Hannah will drop that in there for you. There are 2 links We will also provide those links in the follow-up email that we'll send to you at the conclusion of this webinar. So the final part of the CRC that I think is important to understand is the issue of refugees and asylees. These terms are often used interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. There are very specific guidelines on how to designate what is a refugee and what is an asylee, and it's a very misunderstood concept, and it's important to understand that we adhere to not only international law and international guidelines on these things, but ensure that our countries understand that when a child comes and presents themselves and is requesting a particular legal status in the country, that we have to respect that, despite the fact that they are children. The CRC states that parties shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that a child who is seeking refugee status or is considered a refugee in accordance with applicable international or domestic law, whether unaccompanied or accompanied by his or her parents or by any other person, receive appropriate protection and humanitarian assistance in the enjoyment of applicable rights set forth in the present convention. So those are just a couple of the sort of key legal pieces of the CRC that I think are applicable to the issue of children on the move, protecting them, and ideally protecting them from going missing or being exploited or falling into some other harm or trauma. And it's my hope that by sharing this with you, that these important protections set out in the CRC, you can work as advocates to ensure that every child who is on the move within your country or into your country is given the protection set forth in the convention, and that we push much harder than we have to ensure the accountability of every government who has signed the CRC in respect of protecting children on the move from further harm, exploitation, or going missing. So in addition to legal and policy guidelines on protecting children on the move from going missing or coming to harm, there are other things that must be done to ensure the safety and well-being of every child. Sorry. The first step, and I'll just sort of preface this by saying this is something that I've worked a lot on, both in my time at ICMEC and in my previous job, is recognizing that immigration and child protection are not necessarily linked as closely as one might. So the enforcement of immigration controls do not necessarily go hand in hand with the safe protection of children. So the first thing that we recommend is that we train responsible immigration authorities and border security to recognize potential trafficking. This is a huge problem. Again, part of it is we're expecting that people who are trained in law enforcement should also then be trained to recognize trafficking. And there are arguments to be made that this may be outside their purview, but it's something that I think is crucial, because if we can stop the child at the border and place them in an appropriate, safe situation and away from the traffickers, that we will do a far better job of protecting them. In the US, we know that from experience that many children crossing our southern border are not voluntarily traveling to the United States. They're being brought in by coyotes, they are being brought in by traffickers, they are being brought in to be trafficked. Our recommendation is that in addition to Border Patrol being trained to recognize trafficking, that any adult traveling with a child should be made to prove their relationship to that child, and that children must not be released to the custody of an adult until that adult can prove that they have a relationship to that child. We know here in the US that when a child is taken by Border Patrol and then put into the care and custody of ORR, they are then released to a sponsor. And there has not been the due diligence on making sure that those sponsors are an appropriate placement for that child. And that is obviously in violation of what would be standard practice for child protection workers in placing any child with an adult, whether through foster care, family reunification, or even institutional care. The second thing that we think is really, really important, and it's something that I think there are some models and templates that could be used to do this, but it's the promotion of collaboration between law enforcement officials, migrant-focused organizations, and child protection. It's important that all agencies involved in processing, supporting, or making plans for children on the move should be encouraged to formally cooperate on every case. We should advocate for best interest determinations. Now, best interest determinations are an actual process. The refugee organizations have been using these for years, and it is a collaborative process that every person involved in the planning for the child come together and determine what is in that child's best interest in terms of where they should be placed, and how we can best protect them. Each agency brings a different set of skills. So law enforcement, border patrol, medical health organizations, psychologists, social workers, child protection organizations, each brings a set of skills to the table, and each brings a different perspective of the child's needs and what can legally be done and what are the resources available for each of these individual children. So it's only through that collaboration that we are going to see that each child on the move is really protected, is placed in the appropriate setting, and does not simply go missing after they've been released from the custody of the immigration enforcement or the other responsible organization after they are released from law enforcement. The third thing that we strongly recommend, and I think this is something that has become a bit of a sort of hot topic or I don't know, a sort of a red flag, is the suspension of intercountry adoptions until a crisis is over. We know that in times of crisis, there is this sort of knee-jerk reaction. We have to go in, we've got to help these kids, or we have to, make sure that they're all being protected, and we're going to do this through adoption. I mean, we saw plane loads of kids being taken from Haiti, and we know that this is not in the child's best interest. Adoptions during times of crisis often lead to irregular, unsupervised placements with adoptive families. These placements are not in the best interest of the child, and in many, many cases, they are not sustainable because they have not gone through the appropriate steps to make sure that the adoption is legal in the country of final destination. In some cases, children who are separated from their parents during migration are assumed to be orphans and placed into the adoption system. So we're going to see this with kids from the Ukraine. We've seen these pictures of these, lone kids crossing the border into Poland or into other countries. And I think there is a very strong assumption that these kids are alone, that they don't have family, and that they, should be placed into a situation where they can be adopted. It may not be the case at all. Irregular adoption mechanisms result in the lack of proper process, and the vetting of adopting individuals is often sort of pushed aside. So there is a strong possibility that when you're rushing to get kids adopted because you think that they've been orphaned because of the war, we're not properly evaluating the adults who are going to adopt these children. And this again can put a child in a situation of being trafficked for either labor or for sexual exploitation. We also strongly oppose the idea of visitation for adoption during a crisis. There is a lot of information coming out about kids from Ukrainian orphanages still being sent to foreign countries to visit prospective adoptive parents. And again, because we cannot verify the status of these children, nor can we verify the appropriateness of the adults who may be adopting these children, we're potentially putting these children in harm's way. So until the crisis is over and it is safe to return the child to the home, or to the home country, or be able to verify that they are in fact eligible for adoption, there should be no intercountry adoptions during times of crisis. And related to that, obviously, is this need to do what in child welfare, child protection language is called family finding and engagement. We need to make sure that every single child for whom the government or an organization within the country is responsible is taking every step and making every effort to identify potential family placements for children. In addition to that, we must engage with those family members. We have to assess those family members, and we have to make sure that if the child is to be reunited with those family members, that it is in that child's best interest. Once family members have been located, we would strongly advocate for the use of home studies, background checks, previous or prior involvement with child welfare. We need to also understand why the child was on the move in the first place. If the child was forced by family to move for work or for other reasons, or there was abuse or neglect in the home, or the family is simply not in a position at this time to take full custody and care for that child, we need to know that prior to placing that child with that family. It is the same thing we would do with any child who was entering foster care and potentially being reunited or being placed in family care. We need to take the same steps for children on the move, again, because if we don't do this, we're potentially putting that child in harm's way by placing them with an inappropriate adult guardian or placing them back in a situation that is not sustainable and it is not in their best interest to protect their well-being, and having that child thrive and be safe. The other thing that we need to do, and we have many countries have systems in place for either family or others to report a missing child. So even during times of crisis, a country should have a mechanism in place that allows the public to easily report a missing child and to provide leads on that case. This mechanism may be a dedicated toll-free hotline, or simply a website managed and maintained by law enforcement or by non-governmental organizations working in conjunction with a responsible investigative agency. Further, it's necessary that the public be informed and made aware of the reporting mechanism and knows how to submit a report of a missing child. So if there are large groups of children on the move, and even if another child or an appropriate adult who was in charge with taking care of that child knows that a child has gone missing, there has to be a mechanism for that adult or that child to report the missing child. And there has to be in place a series of steps to make sure that there is an investigation into how that child went missing and where that child is now. It's also important, and this is a bit of a tricky subject, because sharing of information across country borders is often limited because of data protection issues. But we think it's really important that there is intercountry cooperation on the reports of missing children. Because so many children on the move are crossing an international border, it's important that country A be able to talk to country B and say, we have a report of a missing child, it is our belief that that child is entering your country, there has to be a system in place so that that kind of information can be shared quickly and that there can be an appropriate response on both sides of the border to ensure that that missing child is looked for and found safely. So what can we do? There are a few useful things we can do in addition to the above mentioned activities. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those, and then we can get into some Q&A. So ICMEC has proprietary technology called the GMC engine, which is the world's largest search engine for missing children. This, to me, is one of the real opportunities for countries, organizations, agencies, law enforcement, border patrol, to have access to technology that will be able to immediately search for a missing child, or when a child is found, to see if there are reports of that child missing somewhere else, and then going through the process of re-engaging that child with their family. So the GMC engine, as I said, is the world's largest search engine for missing children. It can be used reactively to alert the public of missing child cases, manage case information, and search for and locate missing children. So the GMC engine can actually scour both the clear and dark web for images of the child. It has a capacity called date, place, time, radius, which means that if it captures an image of a child that has been posted either intentionally or even accidentally. So you're taking a picture of, your wonderful tapas in Barcelona, and you happen to catch an image of a child behind you as you're taking that picture, we can still capture that image, and then we know exactly where that child was at what time. So once something is uploaded to social media, and the date and the place and the time are noted in the upload, then that gives law enforcement just an additional step for being able to identify where that child was and when. It can also be proactively used to register information about refugee children and information about the adults they are traveling with as they cross a border. So let's imagine that if Poland had this technology, every refugee child coming in from Ukraine would be entered into the system. And when that child's parents came across and were looking for them, you would have that information in the case management system, and the process of reuniting the child with the family would obviously go much more quickly. As the largest missing child alerting system in the world, case managers have the ability to geo-target alerts to specific cities and regions. So when a child is reported missing, the person who is taking that report can send that alert to the place where they think the child is going. Following established frameworks and guidelines for locating and recovering missing children and utilizing technology and other targeted tools, we can ensure that children are reunited with their families quickly and safely. The GMC engine can also be used to check to see if a child on the move has been reported missing either in the country in which they are currently or from where they left. This is particularly important in terms of identifying children who may be victims of trafficking. So if the parents have reported that child missing in a country where there's a GMCN, a Global Missing Child Network member, and that child has been reported missing, when they enter the second country, if that country has this technology, they will see that that child has been reported missing, and that the person with whom they're traveling or the group with whom they're traveling are not the appropriate caregivers for that child, and that child can be taken into protective care. We also feel like it's highly recommended that Border Patrol or other agencies responsible for processing the arrival of children on the move use this technology to search for the status of every child entering or leaving the country. So this is just one piece of technology that we think could be incredibly useful in both identifying children potentially who are being trafficked, for locating missing children who've been reported missing in their country or location of origin, and has the capacity to be very responsive to the issue of children on the move and their potential vulnerabilities to going missing, either during their journey or when they arrive at their country of final destination. Just want to make sure I'm on track. Yes. The next piece of the next thing we think that is really important, and again, I spoke a little bit about this earlier on when talking about alternative care and best practices. Children should not be returned to their home until it's safe to do so. Again, we often look at children on the move or children who are arriving in a country, or children who've been reported missing but are in our care. Somehow we want to treat them differently than we would children who are legally in our country or who are part of the child protection system already. And so often corners are cut in terms of what the process is when we take care of these children and then prepare to return them. As I stated above, home studies, background checks, previous involvement with child protective services must be conducted before a child who has been identified as being on the move or missing is returned to their family of origin or from where they left, whether it be family or whether it be alternative care situations. In addition, if the reason the child left the country or location from where they came, if the situation in that country remains unsafe, then we should not be returning children to those countries. Obviously, we would look at the issue of child deportation as being completely counter to the child's best interest. If children left, again, going back to the beginning of the presentation, whether it's war or armed conflict, it's an environmental disaster. If those things are still in place when the child is recovered, we need to make sure that there are opportunities for that child to be either placed into alternative care or to be placed or reunited with family until it becomes safe for them to return to their country of origin. The most important thing we can do for children on the move is to provide the same protections for each and every one of them that we provide for children in our own countries who are vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, psychological or emotional trauma, or discrimination of any kind. We have to stop separating kids into types and look at children as children, and that our job is to provide the best situation and care we can to ensure that they do not become either more vulnerable or are placed in situations that are going to further traumatize or cause harm to them. So finally, the steps that we would recommend you take to protect children on the move. The first one is to implement ICMEC's Model Missing Child Framework. That I'm going to talk about 3 documents, and Hannah is going to drop the links to those into the chat. The second document that we recommend is to adopt the recommendations of Children on the Move by International Social Service. International Social Service is a international organization that works on cross-border child protection, and they have written a very, very good set of guidelines on the best way to respond to and care for children on the move. Hannah, I think, is going to drop the links into the chat. And then the third is to adopt the recommended principles, to guide actions concerning children on the move and other children affected by migration. Again, the link to that will be in the chat. And finally, obviously, based on what we know the capacity of our GMC engine is, We encourage everyone to partner with organizations on the ground to encourage the use of the GMC engine. And for Global Missing Children Network members, we highly encourage you to explore ways in which the GMC engine, which you have access to, can be used to protect children on the move from going missing in your countries. So those are our 4 recommendations. And again, if you didn't get the link, we will send that to you in a follow-up email. And that's what I have. So we have time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Northcott, for that. I did drop those links in the chat, but I will also, as Dr. Northcott mentioned, follow up with those in an email with the resources, a copy of the slides, and also a recording of this presentation as well. So we'll go ahead and answer a few questions in the last couple of minutes that we have here. I'll start with one that we have in the Q&A already. This attendee asks, what are some practical ways to equip NGOs who are supporting refugees and migrants with the knowledge or support they need to look for signs of abuse? They seem like some of the first people who could intervene. Do you want to speak to that?
For signs of abuse, I mean, I guess, obviously, my initial thought is you want to make sure that you have people who are appropriately trained and have expertise in those kinds of things, children who are abused or neglected. So engaging with organizations whose primary function is the medical, psychological, emotional well-being of children, to train staff on being able to recognize signs of abuse, neglect, or exploitation would be my first recommendation. Again, based on what our purpose is and what the purpose of our organization is, we may bring a set of skills that is very useful in one area, but we can't be expected to be experts in all of them. And so I highly recommend the use of trained social workers, for example. Social workers are particularly those who are trained to work with children, have the capacity to do things like forensic interviewing with children. There are child advocacy centers that can also be very useful. If you have specific questions about a particular country, I'd be happy to you'll get my email in the next slide, but I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit about organizations that can be helpful in terms of providing the kind of expertise that you would need to be able to identify children who are either being abused, neglected, or exploited in some way.
Great, thank you for that. And we also, Dr. Jordan, in our part 1 of this webinar series, talked a little bit about how to speak to children about potential experiences of abuse or exploitation. So I will also go ahead and provide that recording in the email as well, if that will be helpful. And there's some additional resources and training in that presentation as well. If there's any other questions. Oh,
I was just going to say, and I think this idea of agencies collaborating on each individual child case is really apropos in this particular situation. Again, you want somebody who has the experience and the expertise to be able to really address the potential trauma or harm that child has come to. And so, reaching out and working across disciplines and across organizations. My dog is now barking, but that's just to be expected. So yeah, that's again why we really encourage this sort of interagency, interdisciplinary cooperation when we're trying to figure out what is in that child's best interest and what is the best plan for them moving forward based on what they've experienced while they were missing or while they were on the move.
Great. Thank you. I'll give a few more minutes to anyone who wants to drop a question in the Q&A. Oh, it looks like we have another question here. So do you have advice to gather attention and support from government officials to put funding and support behind this issue of missing children?
Oh boy, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? It's really interesting because I've been working in sort of international child protection and child welfare for over 15 years now. And I think it's always a little mind-boggling that people don't immediately respond to the idea that a missing child is a vulnerable child. I think the way that we are managing this right now at ICMEC is, as Hannah alluded to, we have been working on the first, and it is actually the first time anybody's tried to really quantify the number of children that are missing globally. And I think that once we have that number, and once people are fully aware of the staggering number of children who go missing, and that there will be a response that will be more in line with what we all hope would happen, which is people should be panicked about this. It's terrifying to think that, however many millions of kids go missing every year, and we don't have appropriate resources, we don't have the appropriate things in place to respond to each individual case. And more importantly, when you have large numbers of kids moving, again, we silo kids into the type of missing they might be and give more or less support to and resources for responding to those missing kids. And again, as I said early in the presentation, this idea of voluntary migration. It's like, oh, you came here by choice, so we're going to send you back because there's really no reason you should be here. There isn't a reason that you moved. It's sort of the same mentality that we use when we talk about runaways. Oh, they ran away before, they'll come back. And in fact, we know that children who run away repeatedly are actually more vulnerable to harm and exploitation than potentially a child who's run away for the first time. So I think, understanding the scope of the problem, I think, is going to be really helpful for all of us who work in this arena, because, I think we haven't been able to say with any kind of certainty what the scope of the problem is. And obviously, we're really hopeful that, in the next couple of months, ICMEC is going to be able to provide that information, and that will give you sort of some fodder for pushing governments. And in fact, we're hoping that we'll be able to identify in each country how many kids go missing every year. So if there's a particular country that is interested in knowing what the number of kids missing within their own country, particularly for those places that don't report annually to their central government, we'll be able to provide that information for you. And again, that will give you some fodder for going to the government and saying, we're not talking about 50 kids, we're talking about 50,000 or whatever it happens to be. So it really is our hope that this research is going to be sort of groundbreaking for everybody, not just for ICMEC, but that we'll be able to share with you the results of that research and really help support you in pushing governments to put the kinds of resources behind missing kids and children on the move and the protections that they need from coming to harm or going missing.
Absolutely. The potential for that research is so exciting for so many reasons.
Yeah.
So we have another question here about the GMC engine. How often is the search engine updated? I don't know if this is a question you can answer, or maybe one that we can answer in an email later on, but.
I'm not sure what updated means. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It never stops. So Mike Kashin, who is our CTO, likes to say, a parent would never stop looking for a child, so why should we? So once that child's information is placed into the GMC engine, it constantly runs searches on both the dark and the clear web for any images of that child. And then it reports when there is an image captured, and manual searches can be done, particularly in regards to the issue I was talking about earlier, this date, place, time, radius. And when that is found, that again is evidence and information that can be shared with law enforcement so that there can be a more focused search for that child. But yeah, it never stops. If the child is found, you simply close the case and the GMC engine stops looking for that child. But as long as that case is open, the GMC engine is running every minute of every day.
Amazing. Yes. And this person says that they use it almost every day. So that's really encouraging to hear. And to that point, there's another question about the GMC engine. So I'll just go ahead and bring this one up now. But it asks what things are ICMEC doing to increase the coverage of the GMC engine country database?
Meaning getting into the hands of more people? Is that,
I think so. I think so.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm answering the question that's being asked.
Yes, please correct us if we're not answering your question correctly.
Yeah. If I'm just going off on a tangent, please let me know. I'm always happy to change gears. Obviously, one of the things we're doing is getting the information about the GMC engine out to more people through forum like this, right? We want to make sure that people understand that there is a technology that can do this. We want to make sure that agencies, organizations, countries, central authorities, for example, for those of you who aren't familiar, when a Hague Convention is implemented in a country, a central authority is assigned. We feel like central authorities, Border Patrol, all these things would benefit highly from access to the technology. So we are, as an organization, working very hard to identify potential places that we can engage with to increase the use of the GMC engine. Obviously, we also encourage any countries that do not have a representative to the Global Missing Children's Network, who do all have access to the GMC engine. If your country does not have membership, that you reach out to us so we can talk about that. Because as a network, obviously, then there's the ability to share information and best practices, but also to have access to the technology. So again, if you have specific questions about a specific organization or location, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to set up a time to talk with you about it.
Great, thank you. We have another question here about, so they say, because war or natural disasters can create an immediate surge in migration or displaced children, how can we be more nimble as a global community to help beyond our own borders where there is an urgent need?
You know, that's a tough question. I think, again, I mean, we saw this where you had just massive numbers of kids crossing the borders out of Ukraine, and countries really scrambling to figure out what to do. And obviously, you know, humanitarian aid is part of it, but what needs to happen, it's always hard to have to be reactive than proactive. And so my hope through this webinar is sort of talking about some of the ways in which we're proactively planning for surges of children, that we're not suddenly sitting back and saying, oops, we didn't think about this. So I think part of it is making sure that within your own country or your own jurisdiction, that there is a plan in place that can immediately mobilize resources, particularly for things like alternative care, because the first thing you want that child to be is in a safe place. Once that child is in a safe place, we can then start doing things, you know, other evaluation measures. We need, so that it's sort of a, I know that's not answering the question in the way that you probably want. It's not a sort of step-by-step, but certainly, you know, sharing resources is one key way. Making sure that, you know, or not making sure, but potentially having the ability to, you know, we have the Red Cross that goes across borders to, you know, take care of people's immediate physical needs. But we need to make sure that there are social workers that can, you know, be working with children who've been traumatized, that there are, you know, emotional and psychological support systems in place, that there are the basic needs are being met, and that there is a way to distribute those basic needs in a coordinated way, and to ensure that children are getting what they need as quickly as possible. But again, I think if you look at the guidelines on children on the move that International Social Service has put out, I think you'll get a really good idea of what kinds of things need to be done in order to protect, either large scale or small scale surges of children moving into or out of your country. So I would recommend that as a first step. And then if you have other questions, I'm happy to, again, talk at further or provide you with additional resources that may be useful in your location.
Great, thank you. We have another question here, potentially about relating to the GMC engine, but they ask, Interpol has a good search engine. Does ICMEC work with them or potentially other organizations?
Yeah, we actually have access to the same database they do, but we have additional ones that we can also run through. I'm not the expert on the tech side of the GMC engine. We have offered to our partners, again, the Global Missing Children Network partners, a training on the use of the GMC engine. If that's something that's of interest to people, so you can get a better understanding of what the engine can do and how it works and what the ins and outs. It's not terribly technical, but again, Mike is the expert on this. And so I always like to have him in the room before I answer questions because I don't want to give out incorrect information. But we'd be happy if your organization is interested in looking at this. We'd be happy to set up. It's fairly short, but it'll give you a really good idea of what the GMC engine can do and what it has access to actually start doing those searches. I mean, it's in the billions. The number of images that we have access to is in the billions. But I know Interpol is part of it, and there are other sites and the sets of data that we have access to, but I don't know off the top of my head exactly what they are.
Great. So I don't think I see any more questions, but feel free to drop any last ones here in the Q&A while we finish up. But I do want to thank you all for coming to this part 2. Thank you, Felicity, for the really engaging and interesting presentation, and for all of the questions that we've gotten here in the Q&A. I think these things are so much more engaging, and you learn so much more when you have really great questions. And I feel like we've really gotten that through this. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to Felicity at any of these points of contact, or to visit our website to learn more. Also, make sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter to hear about any other upcoming webinars. We will also, as we mentioned a couple of times in the presentation, have a follow-up email discussing resources and for where you can find further information. And I will also have this contact information there as well. So if you can't get it now, don't worry, you will get it eventually. But if there are no other questions, just a big thank you again for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks, everybody.